looking at these maps. You have a series of things that correlate perfectly with the island as we know it, and then you have things that we've never heard of. So, of course, we want to search for them. The hand-drawn map is clearly Oak Island. And then there are several things named in French which have been translated for us.
There may be 2 treasures on Oak Island, buried centuries apart. The team isn't saying it on camera. The laboratory is. The carbon dating record from this dig comes back as 2 distinct windows, separated by more than 2.5 centuries of silence, one medieval and one colonial, with no connecting thread between them. The shape of that gap is the cleanest argument the modern search has ever produced for 2 treasures, not one. 2 clusters and a silence. There may be 2 treasures on Oak Island, buried centuries apart. That isn't a theory the team has endorsed on camera. It's a reading of what the laboratory has been returning. The carbon dating record from this dig doesn't come back as a single window. It comes back as 2 distinct windows, separated by more than 2 centuries of silence. The first window runs from roughly 1148 to 1400 AD. 6 independent dating methods, all landing inside that same 2.5 century cluster: leather shoe fragments from the swamp, coconut fiber from Smith's Cove, wood buried beneath the swamp pavement, a stone foundation on Lot 5 whose stellar alignment dates to around 1236, a Portuguese copper coin minted between 1369 and 1371, and a worked stone shot whose typology lands in the 14th or 15th century.
We have to follow where the clues lead us, and the clues come from the research.
Good work. This is excellent work. It may lead us to something.
Marty's right. We follow the clues as we have currently interpreted them. So I say we get after it. Let's go look.
The second window runs from roughly 1655 to 1780. The Money Pit's deep timbers, a wooden structure at Smith's Cove, dated by tree ring counting to 1769, human bone from a borehole, and a procession of English and American coins. Between those 2 windows, the laboratory has returned nothing the lab can date. No timber, no bone. The site that gives the lab readable material on both sides of the silence gives the lab nothing across the middle 2.5 centuries. That silence is the most interesting fact on the island. It's also the spine of the case that what's down there isn't one treasure, it's 2. What both sides have. The medieval cluster is built from 6 different dating methods, none of which can borrow from any other. Beta Analytical, one of the most established radiocarbon laboratories in the world, returned the leather shoe fragments at 1148 to 1216 AD, with the outer tail of the date range reaching as far back as 1047. Leather of that age preserved in the conditions the swamp provides means the leather was buried wet, and stayed wet for the better part of a millennium, which is exactly the burial environment medieval period organics need to survive into a modern lab. The coconut fiber from Smith's Cove came back at 1260 to 1400. Coconut fiber on a Nova Scotia coastline is its own anomaly. The nearest place coconut grows is the Caribbean, and the fiber's presence in the original beachwork is one of the artifacts that drew searchers to this lot in the first place. The wood beneath the swamp pavement carbon dates into the 1200s. Professor Adriano Gaspani of the Brera Observatory in Milan ran archaeoastronomy on the Lot 5 round foundation and on the Nolan's Cross Formation. Archaeoastronomy reads the angles between stone features and specific stars at the time of construction, run backwards through the slow wobble of the Earth's axis on a cycle of about 26,000 years. Gaspani's read on Lot 5, 1236 AD, his read on Nolan's Cross, 1217 AD. The Portuguese numismatist Alberto Silva, working in the Azores, narrowed the Pitblado coin recovered on Lot 5 to a 2-year window under King Ferdinand I between 1369 and 1371. The coin is uncirculated, which in numismatic terms means it wasn't handled enough in commerce to wear down its strike. An uncirculated coin wasn't lost decades after it was minted, it was lost close to when it was made. And Laird Niven, the team's site archaeologist, typed the Peacock one-stone shot recovered from Money Pit area spoils to the 14th or 15th century stonemasonry window. Stone shot of that period was hand-shaped for late medieval siege engines and early gunpowder cannon. In workshops, the historical record places squarely in the Mediterranean and Atlantic European maritime tradition. 6 methods, 6 different evidence types, all landing inside the same 2.5 century cluster. The colonial cluster is similar in shape, but tighter. The Money Pit's deep timber complex at 102 feet returned two overlapping carbon-14 windows on the same wood, 1655 to 1695 and 1672 to 1780. Two overlapping windows on the same material is the kind of double confirmation you don't often get in field-recovered samples. The U-shaped timber structure at Smith's Cove was tree ring, dated to 1769. Dendrochronology counts the annual growth rings preserved in wood and matches their pattern against regional master chronologies. When it works, it doesn't return a range. It returns a year. Human bone from borehole H8 at 162 feet came back with a 1600s carbon window. The bone is significant on its own terms, because a coastal dig that produces human remains at 162 feet of depth is producing remains that did not get there by erosion. And the colonial coinage layer on top of all of that, a William III sixpence from 1697 to 1701, Britannia coppers from 1673 and 1694, King George II coppers spanning 1727 to 1760, and a Washington funeral medal from 1800.
So it's underneath this pile. We got another one! That's a coin, look!
It is a coin. All right.
Coins carry their own stamped mint dates, which gives them sharper anchors than carbon ever provides. The colonial side is the better converged of the two. The medieval side reaches across more dating methods. Both sides are internally consistent on their own terms. Walking the two sides. Step back and look at what the dating record actually shows. On the medieval side, 6 different methods returning the same window doesn't happen by accident. Radiocarbon on leather, archaeoastronomy on a stone foundation, numismatic identification on a coin, and stonemasonry typology on a projectile are 4 blind disciplines that share no evidence base. Each method runs on its own materials, is fielded by different specialists in different countries, and is incapable of borrowing from the others, and all of them converge on a window that runs from roughly 1148 to 1400 AD. The colonial side is denser. 5 methods, fewer artifact types, but a tighter cluster, 1655 to 1780. The Money Pit Timber Complex carries 2 carbon windows that overlap on the same material, which is the kind of double confirmation you don't often get on field samples. At Smith's Cove, the 1769 dendrochronology pins to a single year, and the colonial coins arrive with their own mint dates stamped into them, which gives them sharper anchors than carbon ever provides. Then there's the Lot 8 mortar. Archaeometallurgist Emma Culligan and Dr. Ian Spooner ran the chemistry on the binder holding the cradle stones together on Lot 8. Their analysis returned a window that opens after the 1200s and closes before the mid-1700s. The binder bracket doesn't pick a horizon. It spans both. That makes the mortar the cleanest reminder in the artifact record that the chronology refuses to collapse to one answer. It is also the longest interpretive headache on the island, because a material whose dating window covers 500 years of possible construction tells you something was built, but not when and not in which of the 2 horizons. Between roughly 1400 and roughly 1655, the team has nothing dated. Not a single piece of timber, not a single fragment of organic material with any anchor, not a single structural feature the lab can position. The medieval cluster ends, and the colonial cluster begins. In the middle, the laboratory record is empty. 2.5 centuries of silence on a site whose record is, by historical archaeology standards, unusually willing to talk. What the show won't quite say. There are 2 readings of that silence, and the cost of each one is different. The first reading is that a single party operated on Oak Island across more than 500 years. They left medieval material in the swamp, and on the western lots in the 12 and 1300s, came back centuries later and built the deep shaft system, and somehow left no carbon-readable material across the 2.5 centuries in between. That reading is internally possible, but it strains the artifact record in a way that's hard to defend. Continuous human use of a site normally leaves continuous carbon-readable material. Replaced beams, repaired structures, new construction, discarded organics. A 250-year hole inside the dated record is not what a single continuous operation produces. The second reading is that 2 parties used the island independently. A medieval party left behind small material across the island in the 1200s and into the late 1300s. A colonial party arrived 2.5 centuries later, between roughly 1655 and 1780 and built the deep shaft work the modern search is still chasing. No operational continuity, no shared knowledge of what was there. 2 episodes of human activity on the same coastline, separated by enough time that the second arrivals may not have known the first had been there at all. The two-party reading carries fewer costs, but the team itself has been careful not to call it 2 treasures on camera. The language the show has used is softer than that. Phrasing like episodic use or a second horizon in the age of discovery acknowledges what the dating record shows without committing to the framing the dating record most cleanly accepts. And there's a complication. Dan Blankenship, the searcher who founded the Triton Alliance and worked Oak Island from 1965 until his death in 2019, carried a working theory across his decades on this island that doesn't fit cleanly into either of the 2 readings. Blankenship believed a damaged 16th century Spanish galleon may have been forced ashore at Oak Island, and that its crew buried what they were carrying. He defended that theory for 40 years against an audience that wanted a simpler story, and he never recovered the artifact that would have closed it. Blankenship's galleon, if it was real, sits chronologically between the 2 horizons. The 16th century is exactly the middle of the dating silence. If he was right, the silence between the clusters isn't a single empty middle. It's a partial third occupant the lab hasn't yet caught. 2 clusters, 2 centuries apart, with a possible third episode sitting in the middle. The cleanest reading. Step back and look at what survives both readings. The colonial cluster is the more tightly converged of the 2. 2 overlapping carbon windows on the same money pit timber, a dendro date at Smith's Cove that pins to a single year, a human bone returning a coherent century, and 4 lines of coinage all within 150 years of each other. If you didn't know there was anything else on this island, the colonial cluster on its own would tell you that something organized happened here between roughly 1655 and 1780. The medieval cluster is more dispersed, but reaches across more dating methods: radiocarbon, archaeoastronomy, numismatics, and typology, 4 different specialist disciplines that don't borrow from each other, all returning the same window. If you didn't know there was anything else on this island, the medieval cluster would tell you that something European, with capabilities documented in 14th century maritime workshops, was on this coast in the 12 and 1300s. 2 clusters, each internally consistent, with a gap between them no continuous operation reading easily explains, and a possible third occupant sitting inside that gap. The 2 treasures reading is what the dating record cleanest accepts. It is not yet proof. Proof would require an artifact connecting the medieval party to a specific deposit, or a contemporary document that names them in any record of the period. None of that has been recovered. What has been recovered is a bimodal dating distribution on a coastal site that is, by every standard except its own, almost too willing to give the lab something to read. The strength of the case isn't any single artifact. It's the geometry of the record. 11 dating returns across the 2 clusters, 11 independent paths into the lab, all converging on 2 windows that share no boundary and no material. The gap doesn't shrink. The clusters don't blur into each other. The shape of the distribution is the argument. That's the case. The team isn't saying it the way the artifacts are saying it, but the artifacts are saying it. If the medieval side has an address, the medieval cluster on this site is real, the colonial cluster is real. The 2.5 centuries between them are unusually silent in a way a single continuous operation does not produce. Whether the second horizon is a second treasure, a second visit, or something stranger than either is still the team's open question. The dating gap doesn't force a single answer, but the question itself is forced by the laboratory record, not invented around it. The medieval half of this story has its own backstory, and the show has been building it across the same 2 seasons that produced the dating gap. The Pit Blotto coin from Portugal, the Azores origin stone shot, the Morris map symbol matching carvings inside a 14th century Portuguese military order's headquarters, and the Atlantic stepping stones that would have made the crossing physically possible. All of it is the medieval cluster narrowing toward an actual return address, in a town called Tomar, inside the operational era of the Order of Christ. If the medieval horizon has a name attached to it, the colonial horizon's relationship to it changes. A separate operation arriving 2.5 centuries later, on a coastal site whose deep shaft work the medieval party may or may not have known about, is a different story than the conventional one treasure narrative the search has been operating on for 230 years. If you haven't seen the deep dive on the Portuguese origin thesis the team has been building for the medieval horizon, that's the half of this story told from the other direction.